The second set of social process theories that we'll talk about in this lecture take a little bit of a different spin on the cultural transmission process and describe criminal behavior from a learning perspective. So the first one we'll talk about here is differential association theory. And differential association theory combines ideas about cultural transmission and about basic learning principles to try to explain criminal behavior. So the assumption here is very different from social disorganization theory. One thing I want to get you to see with these theories is, I want you to pick out their similarities, but also understand how different they are on some things. And fundamentally, control theories like social disorganization and learning theories like differential association theory come at human behavior from very different perspectives. Both social process theories, very different understanding of how social process works. So in differential association theory, there is a very unique assumption about human nature, about why we do anything that we do. And that assumption is that by nature, humans are compliant and social beings. We have to be taught to commit crime, according to differential association theory, and all of the learning theorists would agree with this. Some of them tend to describe humans like sponges, that we are born, dry and empty, and we have to soak up from every experience the ideas for how it is that we are going to live our lives and do everything that we're going to do. So a human nature person would really strongly disagree with somebody from the social disorganization side. Because if you think back to social disorganization, they said that humans have to be controlled or else we will commit crime. In learning theories, it says, by nature, humans wouldn't commit crime. We're compliant social beings. We have to be taught. The only way we're going to commit crime is if we learn to do it, if we have learned how to, and if we have learned that it's okay to do it. So the first criminologist to introduce us to a learning idea in understanding criminal behavior was an American by the name of Edwin Sutherland. And he was the one that wrote differential association theory. So Edwin Sutherland really began writing a great deal about criminal behavior in the early 1900s and began developing this theory in the 1920s. And he had some kind of interesting influences in his life that led him to developing this theory. One of the big ones was a report that came out in 1933 called the Adler Report. So this was a federally funded, commissioned report that was designed to basically give the discipline of criminology a report card. The Adler Report was designed to find out, what do we know about why people commit crime? What have we learned in the past several decades of research? The Adler Report came out with a very scathing review, a very negative, bad review of all the knowledge that we had built up so far in criminology. It was basically a very harsh critique of what people described as facts in criminology. It concluded with, we know nothing about it, we cannot trust any of the research that's come out, and we should really leave the study of criminology to some specific discipline, like psychology, because people that just try to be criminologists aren't good at it. So this wasn't really good news for someone like Sutherland, who was a budding criminologist and wanted to do this for his life's work. So that was one really big influence on him, wanting to contribute something that could change the face of criminology. He also had some interesting experiences in the 1920s because he worked professionally with thieves. He went into prisons where professional thieves had been caught, and he did a lot of case studies and examinations of people who were lifelong burglars. So it's those kind of, you got to think about Sutherland's perspective here. This discipline, criminology, was in crisis in the 1930s, 1920s. He wanted to write something that would move us out of the biological eugenics kind of faulty ideas. He wanted to move us away from that and firmly plant the study of crime in sociology. So he decided to, kind of write this theory. But even at the time, the theory wasn't really very flushed out. It wasn't really very, it wasn't explained in a whole lot of depth. his point really was to make a splash with something and to turn the direction of criminology. So, and I think you'll see with his theory, it kind of almost sounds as you go through it like you're going to be wanting more as you read it. You're going to want more clarification and explanation, and you're not necessarily going to get it, because the theory as we know it was his first attempt at using sociology and a learning idea to explain criminal behavior. So, in this theory, differential association theory, he came up with 9 propositions, which according to him can kind of lay out and explain criminal behavior. And incidentally, these are on page 159 of your Hagen book. So, the first proposition that he wrote into his paper, number 1, criminal behavior is learned. Right there, he wanted to immediately separate criminal behavior from biology, psychology, from eugenics, from, body typing. Criminal behavior, according to him, is something that you have to learn to do. Now, he also had to describe, okay, well, where do we learn this? The second proposition is where he says, we learn criminal behavior through interactions with others. Specifically, we mostly learn them from intimate others, intimate personal groups, friends, family. For him, those are the most important learning groups for people who are going to teach us, who we're going to learn about criminal behavior from. He also had to kind of account for, okay, what do we learn from these people? And according to him, we learn the techniques and the motives and attitudes and beliefs to commit crime. So not only do you learn from people kind of how to be a criminal, the techniques, but you also learn from people, the motivation. You learn from people over time that it's okay, that it's cool, that it's all right to commit crime if it gets you what you want, it makes you feel better, if it's going to get you status with your friends. You have to learn all those things, according to him. And over time, depending on who you learn from in your life, you're going to develop a kind of set of motives for action. And the direction of those motives over time is either going to tend to favor the law or not favor the law. In other words, over time, depending on the people that you learn from, you might tend to favor lawbreaking, or you might tend to think that lawbreaking is bad. That's going to happen as you learn and evolve and continue to absorb information. Now, this next one is really the critical one in his propositions. Most people talk about this as being the most important of his 9 propositions. And according to this proposition, you become delinquent. So for him, criminal. You become a delinquent when you have an excess of definitions favorable to breaking the law. And if that sounds a little vague, what are excess of definitions? Like that's okay. If it sounds a little vague to you, it's a little vague to everybody who read it at the time. What he was, I think, trying to say with this proposition is that if more people than not have taught you over time morals and attitudes and beliefs and values that are favorable to breaking the law, if you have more of that in your background than you do people teaching you that breaking the law is bad, you're probably going to be a delinquent. So these definitions that he's talking about can mean a variety of things. And according to him, these definitions can vary. Not everyone has the same level of delinquency. So he wanted to kind of account for that in these propositions. The delinquency varies by frequency. Some people commit multiple crimes a week, some 1 or 2 a year. It varies by intensity. Some people tend to be fairly non-violent. Some people dabble all over the place. Some people are more violent offenders. Priority, meaning delinquency is much more part of some people's lives. It's much more part of their status than it is other people. And duration. Some people commit a few crimes early in life and then, have a fairly stable desisting pattern. Other people will be offenders their entire lives. Now, in this theory, this is a learning theory. He says that we learn to be criminals. So, in this next proposition, he tried to address how that actually happens, but he doesn't really do it in a very good way. So Sutherland says that the learning process happens just like we learn anything else. We learn to be a criminal just like you would learn to be a banker, or you would learn to ride a bike. The process for him wasn't really worth fleshing out and explaining, and he really wasn't a learning scholar, so it was probably smart of him to not go into too much detail here. But for him, the learning process is just like anything else. And this last proposition is always the one that people tend to be a little bit confused about, because it is a little bit of a confusing in how it's worded. But basically what the proposition says is that delinquency typically doesn't fulfill the values of legitimate acts. What he means by that is when you learn to be a delinquent, and when you're primarily somebody who's going to be a delinquent and committing crimes, you're typically not doing those to fulfill legitimate goals, to earn money to feed your family. You know, what he's saying is most people don't resort to crime to live an otherwise legitimate, normal lifestyle. So if those propositions sounded a little vague and you have more questions than you've had things answered for you, you should probably feel that way after reading those propositions. And you know, in Sutherland's defense, he wrote this theory because he wanted to make a statement. He wanted to pull the study of crime into sociology. He actually didn't even have much of a chance after this article was published to defend his work and follow up and keep doing research, because he died only about a decade after this article got published. So there are a lot of critiques and problems with this theory as he initially wrote it. A couple of the big criticisms would have to be his lack of concern about the how. He says that we learn to commit crime just like we learn anything else. Well, a lot of people argued we need a lot more on how crime is learned, because as you're describing it, people just didn't believe and didn't understand that the process could be the same as anything else. Another one of the big criticisms has to do with that most important proposition, that you become a criminal, you become delinquent when you have an excess of definitions favorable to breaking the law. Well, there are a bunch of research papers out there just trying to get at exactly what the heck he meant by definitions and an excess of them. How many definitions are in excess? Is there some equation that if you have 15 criminal definitions and 8 legitimate ones, you're a criminal? It's a weird concept to try to measure, and it's really not measurable for most people. So most people, upon first reading it, said, I get what you're trying to say, but the way that you said it is confusing and way too vague to further along with research. So the conclusion that a lot of people came to at the end of differential association theory was, okay, good start. We get it. You think crime is learned. But most people argue that it's really not enough. It's really not deep enough of an explanation to really be convincing as a criminological theory. So the solution that people came to was not to throw it out, because there's a lot of the learning aspect was something that a lot of people that resonated with a lot of people, but they wanted to update it and talk much more specifically about the learning process. So the way that it evolved in the decades after Sutherland created the differential association theory was to evolve it into something that we call social learning theory. Social learning theory, the first time that researchers really formalized it as a new and updated version of differential association theory, came in the late 70s with criminologists that were headed up by a man named Ron Akers. So Akers and several other colleagues wrote about social learning theory in the late 70s. And unlike Sutherland, Ron Akers actually had an extensive background in learning theory. He was, you know, first and foremost a psychologist and a behavioral psychologist. So he kind of brought all of that into this explanation of criminal behavior. And he was one of the people that really specifically talked about this how it is that we actually learn to be a criminal. So according to Akers, you don't just learn from intimate others. That was one of the problems he found with Sutherland's original theory. There are a lot of other ways that we can learn. And he had a couple mechanisms that he described as ways that we learn everything. So according to him, the way that we learn to commit crime is the same as we learn everything else, but he wanted to explain it much more fully. So one of the mechanisms that he talks about was differential association, that when we tend to associate only with, particular groups of people, and those people have delinquent values, yes, we are going to, tend to become a delinquent. So that idea from Sutherland, he borrowed. He also talks about three others. These idea of definitions coming back in, meaning, values, moral conscience, kind of right, wrong ideas. If your values and your ideas of right and wrong are maybe not completely along the straight and narrow. If you're someone who has over time developed an idea that it's okay to commit crime in certain situations, if you have those kind of definitions, that was another way that he would argue your likelihood of committing crime is going to be high. And he also talked about imitation and modeling. Think back to that Albert Bandura study that I showed you guys, where he wanted to show that aggression is learned because kids just imitate what they see, and they even imitate aggression if prompted. Well, he also wanted to include imitation and modeling in his theory, that one way that we learn to do stuff is we ape it. We learn it, we watch others doing things, we then do them. So according to him, one way that you can start committing crime is if you see someone else do it, you see them benefit from it, you give it a shot. For him, that's a very possible and probably frequent way that people get into crime. And then he brought in the ideas of operant conditioning. So I told you that was going to come back. And this is the theory where it really gets incorporated fully into a theory of crime. Because according to him, operant conditioning also plays a huge role in learning to commit crime. If you get positively or negatively reinforced and that strengthens your likelihood to commit crime, it's going to be a meaningful pattern in your life. Think about if you're a young kid and you're committing your first couple acts that are going to get you into a gang. That first crime that you commit, that's going to get you status and respect. That's a positive reinforcement that you're being given, and you're not being punished for those things anymore. So according to him, these kind of reinforcement patterns, the more that we get reinforced for doing criminal things, and the more that we avoid or don't get punished for them, that's just going to keep strengthening the behavior. So again, to lay this theory out in kind of a model, he starts out by saying that social learning has 4 basic mechanisms, and this is the mechanisms that everybody learns everything, including crime. We have differential associations. We have people that we tend to associate with more than others. Depending on who those people are, that can have a large influence on our thoughts and behaviors. We also have definitions, senses of right and wrong, moral values that have become ingrained in our heads over time. The strength of those and the direction of those is going to also play a big role. And then he added in this imitation idea that the people that we have access to, that we watch and observe, are likely to be imitated by us, and the idea of reinforcement, that if we get rewarded for criminal behavior or we don't get punished for it, that's going to matter. So he starts out by saying all of these mechanisms are in place. Now, for some people, and for a lot of people, their social learning mechanisms are actually going to lead to a life of conforming. I mean, think about all of your lives. You're all in my class, which means that you're not in prison. So I would like to think that you all have had fairly non-criminal social learning mechanisms. You have people that you associate with who tend to not be criminal, so you don't see it around you a lot, personally. You don't have a lot of people to really closely imitate. If you do things wrong, you probably get a little bit of negative. You probably get a little bit of punishment for it. And, your definitions of right and wrong are probably more in alignment with the law. So that's how he kind of explains why some people commit crime, but many people don't. Everybody socially learns. Some people's mechanisms for social learning are conforming. But for the people whose social learning mechanisms aren't necessarily conforming, that can lead them to kind of committing, a first delinquent act. So again, think back to that kid joining a gang for the first time. He has to do something in order to get into the gang. Let's say he has to rob a store. That actually tends to be a fairly common rite of passage for kids. They have to stick someone up, hold someone up in a store. So they commit that initial delinquent act. After they do it, if they're successful, their definitions start to change. They start to learn that that kind of behavior is going to get them what they want. It's okay to do because it's going to get them in the gang. And they start experiencing social and non-social reinforcement. So when I say social reinforcement, I mean what you get back from people. You're going to start to feel like you've achieved a higher status. You're going to feel more powerful. You're going to feel like you're being looked at in a certain light. But there are also non-social reinforcements at work. If you stick someone up and you get this incredible adrenaline rush from it, and you're excited and you wanna find that feeling again, that's a non-social reinforcement. You'll commit another delinquent act because you want that feeling, you want that rush, you want that level of excitement. So this you can kind of see how, according to Akers and his colleagues, this is why people kind of get into a serious pattern of offending, because they start to learn and they become kind of socialized into this being a normal, acceptable activity to do. So one of the future areas in learning theory has to do with looking at social learning theory and really examining how it is that our peers play a role in what we learn, how we learn it, and changes in peers, what that does to changing our learning. So obviously joining a gang is a big thing that gets looked at from social learning theory. Joining a gang is a social process. And one thing that a lot of people are interested in is looking at whether or not the actual act of joining a gang, becoming a gang member, makes people worse. So one of the questions is, when you join a gang, are you already pretty criminal and delinquent and you just find similar other people? Or when you join a gang, does that gang reinforce things and change your ideas and actually have an impact on you? So people doing gang research often look at it from a learning perspective because they want to see if the gang is a formative, changing group to be in. People who look at social learning theory and peers also look at the lack of peers and what effect social isolation has on people in terms of their criminal behavior. Does being a social isolate, does being a loner actually increase or decrease your criminal behavior? And there's some kind of early research coming out in the past 10 or 12 years that's really suggesting that social isolates are just as risky as people who are socially ingrained in a bad peer group. The idea being social isolates also don't have good conventional, normal people to learn from. They are lacking in those, and there's a lot of stuff that still has to be done looking at this, but the idea being, being alone is almost just as risky and just as bad as being with a bad group. Another thing that learning theorists look at is what effect marriage can have on your criminality. And we'll talk about this a little bit later on in the class. Not this class, but in the course in general. So I don't want to go into it in too much detail, but the idea being, when you get married, what does that do to your influences? What does that do to how much you spend time with your peers? What kind of behaviors get reinforced by your spouse, and how different are those behaviors than behaviors that you had when you were single? So people look at marriage and they look at whether or not marriage is actually a point of change for people that used to commit crime. Another kind of interesting thing that people have been looking at recently in this area has to do with the idea that peers might balance each other out. So the idea being, if you have people who come together and they're not necessarily equal on their level of deviance. Say one person has been getting into trouble for most of his young life, the other person is fairly straight-laced. When those people come together and form a friendship group, does one go all the way over to the other person's side, or do they kind of meet each other in the middle in terms of behavior? And what people have been finding is they do tend to balance each other out. If kids get together from very far ends of the spectrum in terms of delinquent behavior, the kid who was really, really good initially, commits a little bit more delinquency than he used to, and the kid who used to be really bad cleans up his act a little bit. They kind of meet each other in the middle behaviorally. But again, very new stuff that's coming out recently, looking at how learning and reinforcement can change people.